Welcome to this session on air potato management. My name is Dr. Whitney Elmore. I'm the University of Florida Pasco County Extension Director and Urban Horticulture Agent. So, air potato management is not very new, but there are some interesting developments that I'd like to bring your attention to and discuss integrated pest management for this particular invasive exotic plant. So, in this particular session, I want to walk you through a little bit of background information about this plant, how it was introduced to Florida, a little bit about its description so that you'd be able to identify it. It's pretty easy to identify compared to a lot of other plants that you'd find in the landscape. Talk just briefly about some of the ecological impacts, the damage that this plant has done, and then get over into preventative, mechanical, cultural, and even biological control in our discussion of integrated pest management methods. So, as a very brief introduction here to air potato or Dioscorea bulbifera, you can see this plant here is quite pretty. Deep green leaves, big heart-shaped or cordate leaves, native to tropical Asia and Africa, but it did find its way into the United States and into Florida somewhere around the early 1900s, maybe 1905. It was documented in Florida at that time. Probably came in through trade, maybe even travel through China. It was first brought in for studies on its use as a food crop because it does produce tubers or what we call bulbils that we'll talk about a little bit later on, and I'll show you some photos. But we did find that it is toxic. The strains that will grow in Florida are toxic. So it didn't make its way over as a food crop, and it can't be utilized as a forage crop for livestock either. But gardeners did pick up on this many decades ago as being a beautiful plant that grows very quickly. And so they decided to, in some cases, sell this plant across the state, and it found its way into um, unmanaged populations. And because it does grow so quickly, it takes over native vegetation very fast. So it became a noxious weed, basically, and has the ability to displace native plant populations. In 1999, the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services labeled this as an exotic, non-native plant, or a Florida noxious weed. It found its way onto that list, which means we want to do everything possible to try to control its spread. Now, I do want to have a very brief discussion about control and eradication. They are not the same thing. Eradication, most folks think about that as being the complete and utter removal, obliteration of a invasive plant or animal. That's just not possible with the great majority of invasives, especially with this plant, but control is possible. Control does not mean total eradication, but it does mean that we have the ability to suppress it and limit its spread and its potential for damage. One of the other reasons besides displacing natives that we really want to control this invasive plant is because it disrupts a lot of natural processes. We know that it can make fires, which are normal parts of many of our landscapes in Florida, and even required by some plants like our pine trees. It can cause those fires to burn taller and hotter, doing damage to the canopy when otherwise the fires would burn lower and slower and cooler. So it does disrupt those native processes, and it does disrupt water movement throughout the landscape as well, resulting in habitat loss for not only other plants but even some animals that depend on those other plants for food, maybe for protection, for shelter. But it also changes the overall ecological structure and the community and ecological functions of those plants and animals. So it does a lot of environmental damage. And it is an absolute land management nightmare if you get this onto your property because it does spread so very, very fast. So it is within the yam family, and we do have native yams in Florida that are not noxious, that we do not want to try to control, that we want to leave alone and let grow naturally. This is a herbaceous twining vine. Most of those other yams don't get nearly this tall or grow this fast, and most of those will produce bulbils or tubers that are long, cylindrical, dark, maybe rough. not nearly as round and smooth like you'd see this bulbil or air tuber in this photo. Also, the veins arise from kind of a terminal apex point on the leaf, like you see in this picture for the invasive air potato, and it doesn't arise in the same fashion. If you look at the leaf itself, they look similar, but you'll notice that those leaf veins don't arise from the leaf base. They branch out all the way across that leaf. And these are alternately arranged on the stem where the petiole is connected to the actual vine itself or the stem. These are alternately arranged, and you won't find that in those native yams. But it does grow incredibly fast, up to 8 inches a day through the heat of summer, up to 70 inches in a year. Very broad, heart-shaped leaves. We call those cordate-shaped leaves. When it does flower, which we don't see very much of in Florida, the flowers are very small, not very showy, not very smelly, so you wouldn't even notice them. But it does reproduce very fast through these aerial tubers or bulbils, and so that's a vegetative reproduction, not a sexual reproduction through seeds. The bulbils, again, are round, kind of oval in shape, vary tremendously in size from something not much larger than your thumbnail up to tubers that can be a couple of feet in diameter and weigh many pounds. The larger the tubers usually are found underground, and those are at least 6 inches in diameter and wider. I have seen them up to 2 feet in diameter. Sometimes the bulbils will tend to grow together or coalesce and make them appear bigger, but there's several of them that have grown together and not individual ones. But the ones that you tend to find on the aerial portion of the plant, hanging off of the vine, are usually just maybe up to an inch, maybe 2 inches in diameter at the most. But this is its primary mode of spread, and it can spread itself around in a variety of ways. Not only does it grow incredibly fast and climb to the tops of trees, creating these fire ladders, moving fire around very quickly and easily, but it outcompetes with our native populations of plants. And new plants are forming from bulbils pretty much all the time, and it has the ability to very quickly and easily take over a landscape because it can outcompete with a lot of these other plants for nutrients, for space, and for water. So in the winter, we do see the aerial stems die back, but the bulbils remain in the ground or just above the ground and will sprout back in the spring. We usually see these creep back out in May through October is when they're going to be very, very active. And those smaller bulbils are going to mean that it's very difficult to control. The primary means of control is temporary, and it's pretty much ineffective in just trying to remove the bulbils where the plant is going to sprout back from. They're small, they're hard to see, they're intertwined with the vines, other plants laying around sometimes on other vegetation or on the floor of the landscape, so they're hard to see, hard to control, and this is how it's going to be able to move itself around very, very well. Management, the key is always going to be with prevention. And that's difficult when those bulbils tend to be very small and they're pretty much everywhere. But because it is the primary mode of spread, if we can control the bulbils and remove those physically from the environment, theoretically we can prevent the spread and suppress the growth of the plant in other places. So we do find it sometimes in debris, contaminated brush, soil that's being moved around. It's very easy to move these bulbils around if you don't notice them or even know what they are. It's easy to hit them with a mower if we're mowing through an area. Throw them, split them, divide them, and each piece could potentially become a plant then. Even kids are known to pick these up and throw them around. We also do believe that they're probably moved around, especially the smaller ones, by birds, maybe some other animals. And because these do float, we tend to find them worse in terms of infestation after a flood. The spread gets much worse. With them floating when we're clearing lands, when we have flood potential, we should be very careful to try to remove as many of the bulbils as possible and prevent them from getting into waterways, either through flooding or by us hitting them and throwing them into the water potentially. They float to other locations and the spread is obvious. So from a cultural standpoint, cultural techniques can be pretty useful for small populations of the plant, which likes to invade very open, disturbed areas where we've burned, where we're clearing, mowing. And if we have an overall healthy ecosystem with a lot of diversity of other plants, we can deter invasion of this plant. We can try to outcompete it for resources, but because it grows so fast and it has such easy mechanism of spread that's vegetative, it moves so very quickly and easily, it's pretty hard to outcompete this plant. So in some areas where we find large populations of it, there are these roundups where volunteers are brought in to do hand removal of the vine and bulbils above and below ground as much as possible. And you can see that picture up there in the top showing the results of a roundup. It's where we're digging them up and removing as many of the tubers as possible, destroying them. This is not incredibly useful for areas that have a tremendous amount of air potato infestation, but it is useful for areas that is not easily accessible or easily treated, especially with herbicides. Simply because areas where we have a lot of desirable plants that we don't want to target accidentally with herbicides, this can be a very useful method. Combined with herbicide control, cultural controls are really effective when we combine the two into an integrated approach that we'll discuss in just a few minutes. You can see up in Gainesville, in their parks and recreation departments, they do frequent air potato roundups, and in one year they got over 13 tons of bulbils alone, with volunteers helping them. So in some places, especially parks, where spraying is not a viable option or a very good option, these roundups can be quite effective at limiting spread. Mechanical control is another management technique that helps to limit spread, but we do find that a lot of times we're doing a lot of damage to vegetation that the air potato has grown up into and is smothering out because we're stripping out that vine. So we do have to try to be as careful as possible to limit damage to our non-targets or our desirable plants by being as careful as possible, making sure we've identified the air potato and removing it as easily as we possibly can. Burning in some places, because of having air potato is not a good idea because of those fire ladders up into the treetops. It can be more dangerous and it can do a lot more damage than a natural or controlled burn would do in an area not infested with air potato. So burning is not a very good option to try to control air potato. Mowing is pretty good in terms of its ability to suppress the plant. It won't completely kill it, but the plant does not like to be mowed very frequently. So it can help to decrease its growth and spread. The problem is it's very easy to hit these bulbils. If we've come through and physically removed bulbils, this could be a very viable option in and of itself to control the plant. But because we're slinging and hitting these bulbils with the mowers, it limits that mechanical technique's effectiveness as well. So physical removal by hand and not mechanical means, and I know nobody likes to hear that, is really our most viable physical option or cultural option at this point in time. Now, from a chemical standpoint, there are effective controls, but they're usually not going to be single application options. We're usually having to come back and make multiple applications in the same area over and over again because we constantly have new bulbils sprouting and we have new plants. And because these plants are pretty tough and pretty hardy and can outlive some of the damage that they have from the chemical control. So the sprouting of the bulbils is really the major limiting factor from herbicide application, but you also have to remember sometimes it's very difficult to get into heavily infested areas to do effective herbicide control. And also we are doing a lot of damage to our non-targets, our desirable vegetation, because we don't have selective chemical controls. However, triclopyr can be quite effective for a foliar application. You do have to use a non-ionic surfactant, and you can see the ratios there. This is especially effective using it with Garlon A 3A or Garlon 4 in those doses that is mentioned there on the screen. But glyphosate, one of the more common trade names is Roundup, but glyphosate is very effective as well. But both of these are non-selective and will do damage to other plant life. So the herbicides that are used here are systemic herbicides, meaning they'll move throughout the entire plant. Some of the best practices that you should use if you're using chemical controls is to pull down or cut vines of the desirable species before spraying, and that will limit then the ability, because it is a systemic mode of action in most cases, for the herbicide to get all the way to the root and to kill those plants. It doesn't mean it won't damage them, but hopefully you won't lose them completely. But with the air potato, if you can pull it down out of the canopy, you're going to limit the spread of the and the drift of the herbicide into the canopy and onto our desirable plants, but also pull it down. Don't cut it, but try to pull it down as much as you can, and then spray it at ground level to limit drift, but it'll also allow for the movement into those tubers or bulbils, which you're trying to kill and trying to control, because that's the primary mode of spread. So spraying in the spring and the summer between a mature and a young plant, and those considerations are very important. You want to make sure you spray before the bulbils form, which is generally in August. So spraying early when the plant is immature and young will do more damage to the plant compared to a mature plant, and you want to get out ahead of the bulbils, which is the primary mode of spread, and try to treat and knock back these plants prior to them setting the bulbils. It takes a lot of persistence, but it also takes an integrated approach to using different kinds of control methods to get any real level of control in these plants. So we find ourselves with air potato using physical and cultural control techniques, getting in there and doing actual removal. At times, in certain situations, being able to incorporate chemical controls as well into the overall plan. We don't want to take just one particular method and go with it, because they're not individually incredibly effective, but an integrated plan can make them combined much more effective at control. With air potato, we do have, though, a biological option to integrate into our control methods, which is really, really nice. Most of the time, biological controls are not incredibly successful, to be honest, but with the introduction of an air potato beetle that feeds exclusively off of this particular species, Dioscorea bulbifera, we can get pretty effective control, especially when we are integrating it with physical and chemical applications as well. So this is not in and of itself, this little beautiful beetle, a silver bullet. It is another method that can be used in an integrated approach. This leaf-feeding beetle comes from Asia. It was released in Florida in 2011, very controlled releases after many, many years of extensive feeding studies to determine what it would eat. Through these starvation studies, the scientists at the USDA and ARS Invasive Plant Research Lab down in Fort Lauderdale determined that this little beetle will only eat this species. It will not eat any other species of plant, and it will not eat any other species of our yams that are related to this plant. So it is incredibly host specific, which is very nice, and made it effective and made it safe for release into the environment. The adults are very bright red. Now, there were two biotypes that were isolated of this beetle in Asia, the Nepalese biotype, which is brown, and the Chinese biotype. And the adult bright red Chinese biotype was found to be the most effective at controlling air potato compared to its biotype cousin, the Nepalese beetle. So they are small, somewhere around 3/8 of an inch long, and they live for maybe 6 months, maybe even upwards of a year. The females lay about 4,000 eggs in clusters on the undersides of very young, expanding air potato leaves, so that as soon as the babies hatch out, they start munching on the air potato leaves themselves. So the beetle will live out its entire life on the air potato plant. The adult will come in and bite the veins, especially on the underside of the leaves. And that will cause the leaves, because of that damage, to curl up from the edges inward and form this protective cup so that the eggs can be deposited down inside of that rolled up leaf. And then again, once they hatch out, they have a ready food source right there available. No travel needed, no takeout required. The eggs will hatch somewhere in about 4 days. You'll have these tiny little reddish larvae, or an immature stage of life, that will feed on the leaves for about 10 days. And in that time, as the adults begin to emerge then from their larval stage, they will both, the larvae and the adults, begin to feed on the bulbils and on the leaves, and they do a number on these leaves. They are incredibly effective. Now, their feeding won't kill the plant, but the feeding does suppress the plant. And year after year, combined especially with removal of those bulbils, you can start to get much more manageable populations of air potato, and you can start to get some good level of control. Basically, the mature larvae, they drop down into the ground, they burrow into the soil, they'll cocoon themselves in this white secretion, and the adults emerge somewhere around 16 days later, and within a couple of weeks they're already mating and laying eggs, about 15 days after. So their life cycle is fairly quick, but they do a heck of a lot of damage when they're feeding on the air potato plant itself. The larvae tend to feed in groups. They specifically like the tender growing tips, and they will inhibit the ability of this vine to elongate itself. And that reduces its ability to climb up into the trees and to compete with the trees and displace a lot of the vegetation. So the leaves, the vines, we know that those die back across the winter months. This deprives the beetles of food. Most likely, most of the adults, they enter into a resting phase. They'll drop down into the leaf litter under the plant on the ground. They're not feeding during this time. Some will perish, others will survive to start up the life cycle again in the spring as soon as the plant reappears. But we do know the adults and the larvae will not feed on any other plant, so these are very, very safe. One of the most impressive things about these beautiful little beetles is, and you got to really stop and think about this, one beetle can consume over 30 square yards of plant material in its lifetime. That is a tremendous amount, which is really nice considering we have plants that can grow over 8 inches in a day. Anecdotally, where you will normally tend to see these beetles first is feeding in the sunnier locations. This is just something that I have noticed and other folks have noticed. They like the sunnier areas. Once they have deveined and devoured the leaves there and there's nothing left, they'll move into the shadier areas. It is a best practice to try to spray herbicides when the beetles are not present, not very active, so very early or very late in the day. During the heat of the day is when they're going to be actively feeding, so we want to try to avoid spraying them if possible. And also continue to use our integrated pest management approaches, where we look at using herbicides when necessary and where effective, and we also look at a lot of mechanical and cultural controls, physical removal to get rid of these plants. All right, so we're back and we're ready to move on here. Just a little bit of a technical issue. So apologize for that. So you can see here some of the leaves that are being attacked and munched on, and you can see the damage. They'll just completely strip the leaves very, very quickly of any of the green tissue. And you can see that beautiful little beetle moving itself along the leaf there. They do move very quick when they're nice and warm in the heat of the day. They are pretty easily spooked. It's not real common to see them. What you will see is the feeding damage. The beetles are a little hard to see. As we tend to approach the plant to look for them, they kind of stop moving and drop off the plant onto the down into the leaf litter to hide. So they're a little tricky to find sometimes, but if you stand and give yourself a little bit of time in an area where you see active feeding, you'll start to see them coming back out and creeping around pretty quickly. So with this biological control, there were very extensive host range studies done down in Fort Lauderdale in a quarantine facility where they looked at the differences between those two biotypes and found again that they only feed on this very specific species of Dioscorea and no other species of plants or native yams in Florida, which makes them a very viable option to do studies to see how they might be able to control air potato in the wild. And again, they found them to be quite effective at doing some damage overall to this plant. Based on that safety and starvation data and research, there was a field release permit in 2011, and then FDACS, through the Division of Plant Industry, or DPI, started to rear and release air potatoes to the public and into public spaces in 2012, and they have continued that to this day. And I'll tell you how you might be able to get some air potatoes or air potato beetles for free as well. They have found through extensive studies that the air potato beetle can reduce the height of the vines, the ability of them to elongate and to climb. They decrease the bulbil production, which is really what we were looking for since that's the primary mode of spread. It does extensive damage overall to the air potato, making it not compete nearly as well with native plants. It does show that through the use of this beetle, we have an increase in native vegetation in areas where they're feeding. It is an excellent, effective addition to an IPM program, or integrated pest management approach, with the cultural removal and herbicide applications when necessary. The long-term impacts on air potato are still being evaluated. And this is where DPI does use a lot of citizen scientists to help them gain some data and some research into how effective these beetles are. They're still looking at how well they overwinter, their movement around the state from one area to the next. So they're still finding out a lot about their biology and behavior. The summary of this particular discussion tells us that air potato is here to stay, but we do have effective biological controls that are safe, but an integrated approach is very necessary and is the most proper and effective management technique possible. Again, we're never going to eradicate this invasive exotic plant, but through the use of integrated approaches and especially that air potato beetle biological control, we can get effective suppression and control. If you are interested in trying to get some beetles either sent to Parks and Rec facility, to your particular organization, or even your home, you can use this link that you see on the screen to fill out a very simple form, and you can send away and ask FDACS to send you some air potato beetles when they have them. They release these very frequently. When they have them, they are very happy to send these out. Sometimes they'll send them in large batches to your local extension offices, and we will disseminate them to the public, any folks that have requested them. You can also reach out to us at the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences and your local extension office to find out more information about management and control or how to get beetles yourself. We also like to hear from folks from time to time telling us that they have seen the beetles and also telling us if they're seeing control or suppression where the beetles are feeding and how that their particular management approaches are working on their property. So I do appreciate you spending some time with us today to talk about a pretty serious invasive plant in the state of Florida. You can find us online at the website listed on Twitter and on Facebook. And you are always more than welcome to call us at 352-518-0156 or look us up online anytime. And here are a handful of references if you want to take a look at those. You can always stop and start your video on demand to be able to get that website information or any of these particular fact sheets or research data. So thank you again for joining us.